tuned in to The Andrew Lawton Show.
Non-subsidized media, independent media, it is a relatively small community in Canada. One of the best in this space, though, is The Line, founded by Jen Gerson and my old talk radio colleague, Matt Gurney. Great to have Jen Gerson with us in person here. Jen, welcome.
Thank you for having me.
You were speaking on a panel that actually it was one of the more engaging panels because there was a fair bit of contrast about the internet regulations, and there are a great many of them from C11 to C18 and now C63. At its core, you had said something that I found quite interesting, which was that, yes, you're against a lot of what the government's doing, but you're also concerned about a media ecosystem in which there's only a particular type of media left. I mean, frankly, one in which True North fills that void. And I was wondering if you could just expand on that a bit.
Yeah, I mean, this goes back to my argument, and it's a very unpopular argument in this room, and it will definitely be an unpopular argument with your audience, is that I do think there's an important role for an organization like the CBC to play, especially when we're talking about a population. We don't have the same population density in the U.S. We don't have the same economies of scale that the U.S. has, and therefore it's a really, really hard place for private media organizations to cover extensively, particularly when we're talking about local news, right? I'm not talking about Calgary or Toronto. Those places are well served. What about Medicine Hat? What about Lethbridge? What about Moose Jaw? Places like that. These places have become news deserts, and I think it becomes really difficult not only to govern countries that don't have access to good quality journalistic media, but also how do we maintain a sense of national identity and a sense of national cohesion in a media environment where private media has essentially vacated this field. This is where I think that there could be a role for a radically reformed or radically rethought out CBC or something like it to be able to, by statute or by mandate, provide good quality, basic, objective journalism in, say, every town over 100,000 people in this country.
I think the counterpoint to that is that was supposed to be what CBC was doing, and they've had a fair bit of mission creep in the sense that they haven't wanted to do that. I mean, when CBC launched its online opinion section, it's like, can anyone say that opinions on the internet are in short supply, that we need a
government? I'll go further. Why do we have a CBC Gem? Why do we have a CBC streaming service? Did you know that CBC actually is trying to duplicate Duolingo with an app to teach people French and English? I mean, these are things that are radically beyond what most of us would understand the CBC mandate to be. However, the answer to that question isn't necessarily to defund the CBC. The answer is a radical mandate review. And the other thing that I would do is I would take the CBC out of the Broadcasting Act, where it currently nestles and has a very unclear and fairly vague mandate, which permits that kind of mission creep. And I would create a CBC Act. I would essentially put the CBC in statute, and I would enshrine things like their journalistic standards of practice. I would enshrine a standard of journalism that I think most taxpayers could get behind. And I would enshrine things like let's say, for example, every town over 100,000 people needs a CBC reporter, for example. The other thing that I would do with the CBC, I mean, if I were in charge in God, then that's going to happen.
If Poilievre wins, we can put your resume to the top of the pile for taking over.
I would also say everything that the CBC produces should be open source. So every news organization, left, right, center, whatever, should be able to take the CBC's written and visual content and audiovisual content.
Canadian press might not like that, but it would
whatever.
Let it be a public good.
But it's a public good. If we're going to fund it like a public good, we should treat the resources of that thing like a public good. I would have the CBC imagine itself more as a library, like a library of journalistic knowledge and resources. The other thing that I think people are not remembering as well is that the CBC is a huge store of archival information, digital and physical archives. This is the repertoire or the reservoir of a huge amount of Canadian culture and history, and I think that we need to treat it as such and put some serious investment into in maintaining those archives and those archive services for the purpose of maintaining a Canadian culture thing. The other thing I would do, and I would just say this, I would also have the CBC see itself as a training apparatus or a training role. So perhaps you go to the CBC if you want to start a podcast in Lethbridge. Well, maybe you can go to the CBC and get a workshop about how to do podcast editing. Maybe you can go to the CBC and rent out a room. Maybe you can go to the CBC and rent out your equipment, that kind of thing. So I could see them as being a real hub for being a support for creating an innovative media model in a country like Canada, where we have some unique sort of market-based challenges by virtue of our size and lack of population density.
to go back to the local aspect for a moment, one of the challenges with the True North is that, and the line in particular, we're lean operations. Yeah. We can also find a coalition to support what we're doing nationally. Mm-hmm. It would be incredibly difficult, if not impossible, to do that at a local level.
It's a hard, the numbers are really hard. Mm-hmm. Because, how many people do you need to make a living? Well, you really need about a base of about 1,000 people who will pay for you. I mean, it's not huge. It's not unattainable.
It's the old 1,000 true fans.
It's the 1,000 true fans,
yes.
right? So, okay, that's easy when you have, it's not easy, but even in a country of 40 million people, what are our fan bases? Our fan bases are maybe large enough to support our income and a small team around us. They're not large enough to support the 20, 30 person newsrooms of yore. And I think that's just a reality that mainstream media has got to get used to. But if we're talking about, well, how do we ensure that people in Sparwood have good access to local information? Are there going to be 1,000 paying people in Sparwood? Well, maybe for some people. They're really good, but if what you're producing is the local football team, the local basketball team, your local city council, your local court cases, those sorts of things, it's really hard to make the economy of scale work there. And that might be a reason or an argument for some kind of help in the form of maybe it's just the CBC is in that space and supporting any kind of local startups, but also serving that community in that space. I think the CBC also does need to get back into the mindset of its job isn't to be a top-down creator of culture and meaning for people. It's there to serve the people. It's a service that the people need to buy into to understand its value.
If you lost the audience in your CBC plan, I think you can get them back on this one, because you had also made a comment in your remarks on stage that was, I think, probably the most controversial thing you'd say to some people, which was that we need to get comfortable with the idea of things going out of business. And we need to get comfortable 100%. With this idea of collapse, because there's never going to be that reinvention without that death. And what we have now is this weird, indefinite life support model where we're keeping industries that don't want to reform aboard for what?
Well, that's the question. And also, I mean, the line has made a particular point of not accepting government subsidy in any form. Not only do we not accept government subsidy in any form, www.readtheline, please subscribe. Got to get that bitch in. Like and subscribe. But we think that's a bad business model. Not only does it compromise your independence and your integrity and the credibility that you have with an audience, but it's terrible. It's a terrible way to build a sustainable business model, because it means that the next time a government comes in and out of power, your money can get turned off like that. That's not a way to run a business. Now, I understand that to some degree there's always going to be some aspects of subsidy in a country like Canada. Okay, fine. I'm fine with the local journalism initiative that supports local reporters. I don't really have an issue so much with that. I do also understand that there's going to be some subsidies for organizations that are purely cultural. So maybe there's going to be some arts magazine subsidies, those sorts of things. Fine. I'm not too fussed about that. I think that's the table stakes of a country like Canada. There's nothing to be done about it. It's nothing I'm going to get too worked up over. But no, we can't. What we've done is we've moved into a model where basically every single private media outlet, with the exception of maybe you and me, are government subsidized. That's not sustainable. That's insane. Nope. That's completely insane. And the taps are, I think, when Pierre Poilievre becomes prime minister, and I think at this point it's very likely to happen, the taps are just going to get turned off on you. And then what are you going to do? You haven't reformed, you haven't sustained, you haven't built something viable for yourself. You're still bloated, you're still debt-ridden, and you've still lost your advertising monopoly. Now what? Right? There's no There's no future in that.
Yeah. Well, and it cements that path dependency, because now you can't take it away because, we've built our entire businesses around that.
Well, and also you've destroyed your brand models in the process, because now you've taken money from the government, so nobody trusts you. Right?
Yeah, very well said.
And if you want to see, if you believe that money doesn't sway coverage and how things are covered, look at the way that the media who are the recipients of, for example, C63's Google's money. Go look in the past and look at how they covered C63. It was almost
C18.
C18, you're right. I'm sorry.
Yeah, C63 is the online harms one,
I'm talking about the online news act.
All the numbers blur together. It's okay.
That's a problem. Sorry. But go look at how they covered themselves in that.
Yeah.
There was very, very little coverage outside of the independent media. Organizations like mine, organizations like yours, and academics like Michael Geist. There was very little critical coverage of that. So you can see in real time how money affects the way people approach problems and coverage. And by the way, I don't think that that's even unique to government money or advertising money. The people who cut the check kind of get to set the rules. I mean, you and I, we're right now, the line is 100% reader funded. Everybody who supports us because they find value in our product. The risk of that kind of a model is audience capture, right? Like, how do you make sure that you're providing stuff that's true to yourself and demonstrates integrity for your own beliefs, and not just pander to your audience because that's what they're going to pay for, right? That's a risk. When you have an advertising-based model, you run the risk of being swayed by your advertisers. That's a risk you have to deal with. And when you're predominantly subsidized by government, the government in power is going to affect your ability to pay your rent. Of course, that's going to sway the way that you view news and the way that you're shifting your mindset. That is unavoidable, but the way to avoid that is to try and create as many different revenue streams as possible so that you can avoid too much dependence on one kind of revenue stream. And the other thing is to try and maintain your integrity as much as possible with a high diversity of revenue streams, but also, not making yourself solely dependent on one revenue stream like the government, right? I mean, that's just
which is also true of you, because even though you run the 100%. Line, you're publishing everywhere. I see you all the time, and I love it.
But there's no purity here, right? And there can't be, because in an environment where everybody takes government money, if I want to do any freelancing on the side, I mean, I guess I'm going to the CBC. I'm going to take a fee for going to the CBC, but I'm also going to take a fee if I go to write something for the Star or the Globe.
So you're respectable. You get invited to all these places. I don't.
Yeah, well, that's. I mean, I'm working on it. I mean, one of the funny things of the panel today is that I suddenly realized that I'm not the bomb thrower in the room anymore, and that was a real shift for me.
Viva Fry took that role on your
he
panel.
took that role, and I became the adult in the room, and I'm like, I got a new suit, but my God, like, I didn't think that this had happened. Like, I'm the old respectable lady now. Like, how did that?
He's more of a burn it down person than you are on this,
Yeah, I mean, it was.
And then Michael Geist was like the government defender for a moment,
which is hilarious because Michael Geist is not
a
government defender in everything. I think David and I sort of disagreed on a couple of points, and that was one of them being there are aspects, for example, of the Online Harms Act that are probably good and worth preserving. There's a lot of problems with the Online Harms Act, and I mean, both Michael and I have written in depth and at length about what we think those problems are. I kind of disagreed with David. I think he's got a misapprehension of why mainstream media is in trouble. It's not for the reason that people like to think it is. Most people, especially conservatives, like to think that mainstream media is in trouble because mainstream media doesn't align with their viewpoints, and therefore they've lost audience. And
I think that's contributing, though. I think there is I think the trust. I don't think you can separate the trust deficit from the business issues.
Yes, there's a trust deficit and there's a decline deficit. But the primary, and I think that those are accelerating right now and have accelerated in the last 5 years. But if you want to go back 10, 15 years where the problems with media started, the problems with media started with the collapse of the ad monopolies. And you need to fundamentally understand that. And as the collapse, the money got sucked out of the industry became more and more beholden to a kind of ideological viewpoint, and that contributed to the trust deficit. They became more dependent on government money. That contributed to the trust deficit. But it doesn't start with the trust deficit. It starts with the collapse in the ad monopolies, and this is why you see the same issues affecting mainstream media and legacy media regardless of whether or not they're left or right. Because the reason why these organizations traditionally were able to print money is because they had an absolute ironclad monopoly on the ad market, and particularly on classifieds. The second newspapers lost classifieds, they were in deep shit.
Yeah, fair enough.
Right?
All right. Well, that's the first time that word has ever been uttered on True North. So
Sorry.
that's okay.
Oh, wow, really?
Well, because we have the clean tag on Apple Podcast that we forever lose. So
I'm so sorry.
She has gone more irreverent than me, which is, I think, a great testament to the work at The Line. So, Jen Gerson, I love The Line. I read The Line. You should as well. But it's great to talk to you in person.
You too. Thanks.
Thanks for listening to The Andrew Lawton Show. Support the program by donating to True North at www.tnc.news.